Dunning Insane Asylum, a revolutionary mental institution that set standards for many hospitals, opened in the outskirts of Chicago in a neighborhood called Dunning. The mental hospital opened in 1858, a time of rapid population growth for Chicago. A population of 30,000 people in 1850 had soared to about 112,000 by the next decade. Chicago became the fourth most populous city in the nation, a hub of commercial and cultural influences that resulted from the development of railroads connecting the city from the east to west. With railroads came major job opportunities. Chicago thus became a strong candidate for settlement by immigrants and entrepreneurs. The growth of railroads resulted in a growing manufacturing sector in the United States, and made Chicago a major marketplace for large businesses. This influx in economic wealth circulating in Chicago caused many rural Americans to flock to cities in hopes of attaining jobs. The correlating influx in population in Chicago led to mass overcrowding within the city streets and a mass increase in urban crime. Due to the large quantities of the poor filling the streets and tenements of Chicago, city officials were driven to find a way of getting rid of many of the criminals and mentally ill. The population boom fueled the desire of Dunning Asylum, also known as Chicago State Hospital, to bring many unwanted and vagrant Chicago citizens into their walls. Thus, Chicago's population boom in the 1850s was one of the major reasons behind the opening of the mental institution and the effects it would later bring to the city and to practices behind many mental institutions across the country. The poor, insane, tubercular, stillborn, and vagrant were all admitted to the hospital in hopes of keeping them out of the center of the city. Those in charge of the city during the 1800s wanted to get rid of riffraff downtown. Hence, the Cook County Board bought 80 acres and built a 3-story poorhouse, also known as the county farm. The hospital was described as having
small barred windows, iron doors, and heavy wooden doors outside.
The rooms were like barns with low heat and ventilation. There was no hot water in the winter, and oftentimes inmates went weeks without bathing in order to avoid the freezing waters. There was a large lack of qualified physicians, money, and follow-up care, all contributing to the inability of the institution to properly heal the patients. All of these factors, as well as intense overcrowding since the time of its creation, made conditions even worse for inmates. The separation from the outside world had the most tolling effects on the patients. Patients had an immediate change in social character and moral career based on beliefs that they were being degraded by being sent to the institution. They were humiliated and mortified of themselves and the conditions of the hospitals. Admittance created a disruption in regular life scheduling, particularly because the ability to have visitors or leave the hospital for a day trip was completely forbidden during the initial month or years of admittance. The institution did this to sever all ties for the patients and break up life as they had become comfortable within the outside world. Dunning Asylum faced unsafe conditions because of the lack of care of the board members for the patients, viewing them as people who could never be cured and caring more about the well-being of the city as a whole instead of the population being admitted to the asylum. The board quickly became inhumane and cruel. They valued the benefits the asylum gave for the general public and went to extreme lengths to keep those inside locked up for good. They believed that society could only be whole if the busy streets were without vagrants and the mentally ill. Long-term hospitalization became incredibly common during the time of Dunning because of the selfish desires of the city and the hospital conductors. The owners of the institution took many measures to ensure that the city could be quickly rid of the unwanted. One of these measures was in September of 1882 with the creation of a railway that went from the city directly to Dunning. This arrangement added the convenience of transporting not only goods such as coal and flour, but people to the plot of the land. The philosophy of the institution was expressed in 1914 by a committee of the Illinois State Hospitals Medical Association as a
segregation of the unfit, the insane, the feeble-minded, the defective, delinquent, the criminal, and the like.
This institution was an example of a mismanaged public health system for the urban poor. As a result of the desires of Chicagoans to rid themselves of the urban poor and mentally ill, doctors were willing to use horrible methods which were almost always abusive and stripped the patients of their dignity. In 1915, Dr. F. B. Clark, once acting superintendent of Dunning, wrote,
"The treatment plan of the insane person is one of medieval unpleasantness. The use of hydrotherapy, electroshock therapy, and hormone injections are terrifying, harmful, and questionable treatment value to patients."
These commonly used methods of treatment for those admitted in Dunning were often never shared with the public. The board tried to conceal the horrors of the asylum by having reporters report.
Cleanliness reigns everywhere. Their food is wholesome and clean, and being so unfortunate as to have come at last to an institution of this character, they are made to feel as lightly as possible the restraints that are necessary put about them.
These misconceptions made it possible for those outside of the world of Dunning to ignore the atrocities that were occurring within its walls, and allowed the board to continue treatment at Dunning as they wished. Attempts to cure the ills of mental hospitals, as seen with American social reformer Dorothea Dix, were short-lived at Dunning and commonly ignored because of the inconvenience that widespread reform would have for those running the institution. Mental institutions were still widely neglected, and the power held by the board members made change something that was often unattainable. The Chicago State Hospital used methods new to the field of medical treatment and influenced other institutions in the United States. It rationalized for many hospitals the use of inhumane treatment and was an example to others of how they could completely hide the atrocity that went inside the institution. Dunning made it possible for other mental asylums to follow suit and admit patients that were not truly mentally ill, just undesired in society. Thereafter, many hospitals were built without the intention of fully healing the patients inside, further corrupting the mental health sector in America. Eventually, those who died at Dunning began to be buried by the poorhouse, and those in Chicago who couldn't pay to be buried at Graceland or Rose Hill cemeteries were buried at the county farm at Dunning. The graveyard served a single purpose, a dumping ground for the bodies that were not wanted, neither alive nor dead. At least 16,000 were buried at the cemetery over the years, but the current estimate is closer to 38,000. Buried in the cemetery were 117 unclaimed victims of the Chicago fire. There were hundreds of orphaned and abandoned children from the early ages of Chicago that were plagued by poverty until their early deaths. There were countless Civil War veterans who died alone without any money to their names. And of course, there were various medical patients from facilities including Dunning. As a trend, all were stricken with tragedy and not claimed by any loved ones. Many years after the closure and destruction of the asylum, the Dunning Cemetery was rediscovered by accident by a construction company hoping to build a massive condominium complex. In articles following the rediscovery, it was stated,
The remains uncovered were not from just some casual burial, but were in fact an indicator of the presence of the forgotten Cook County Cemetery.
The cemetery site was excavated for land and building opportunities, completely disregarding the dead buried there. Despite the societal advancement from the time of Dunning until 1989, the government did not care enough about the patients, even in death. They let developers plow right through their bodies and uncover the bones of those who faced poverty and hardships during their lives. Only a small cry of protest emerged from a local pastor who wanted the final resting place remembered. This small outcry did not have a major impact on the developers, and eventually the condominiums were created, with only a small plot of land dedicated as a commemorative park. This shows that even in death, the mentally ill and disregarded citizens of Chicago were not respected, and that both private and public institutions would overlook the integrity of the dead in order to gain a profit. Dunning served as a way for Chicagoans to discard the poor and homeless in their communities, excusing them from being mentally ill. This perception of the mentally ill caused Dunning and other mental institutions to become makeshift subsidiaries for those not accepted within society, allowing many to apply the reasoning of "not in my backyard" to the unwanted in their communities, further damaging the possibilities of integrating them into society. Dunning became a leading institution in the field of mental treatment, using various tactics that are now seen as inhumane. Its legacy is an example of how horribly mental patients were treated, a legacy that provokes the discovery of the purposes behind the mental asylums in America and shows that the asylums were not made with good intentions.